Greetings, family. Welcome to the African Exodus show. I'm your host, Tierney Shiri, here to you with a new video. Before I get started with today's segment, I want to remind you all, if you have not already, please do add yourself to my Telegram channel. Telegram is a decentralized app that I use to update people whenever I post a video, so you can get your updates over there. So I talked about last week the fact that Goshen, the people of Goshen, during the Egyptian captivity, they weren't simply living amongst the Egyptians. They weren't simply doing the things of the Egyptians, and they certainly weren't reliant on the Egyptians. They literally were people who were living separate, people who were living a lifestyle that did not necessitate Egypt to be upheld. And they were, because of that, able to withstand the plagues that came on Egypt. That's something that is very different than most of our people, something very different than most of us experience. We know that as the plagues happened to Egypt, they did not happen to Goshen. As Egypt's crops were killed, Goshen's crops were not killed. As Egypt's livestock were killed, Goshen's livestock weren't killed. We know that as hail came on Egypt, it did not go on Goshen. We know that as diseases came on Egypt, it did not go on Goshen. Now, I wanted to talk about this in light of the fact that our people, although many of us don't know who we are, many of us don't know that we are the children of Yasharel, many of us are not living according to the children of Yasharel, but we can experience a certain grace that is something resemblant of what we saw Goshen receiving. And I want to talk about this in the spirit of COVID-19, because this to me is an obvious effect that there is something different whenever you are living amongst your people in the Holy Land versus living inside of a Babylon captivity. And although Babylon is international, Babylon's home base, where they can exercise ultimate dominion over you, does have a spiritual significance versus the outside of the parameters of the empire, where they do not have as much influence, as much power, and as much ability to suppress you. Now, we're going to talk about this, as I said, in the realm of COVID-19. I want to first show you this chart right here. Many of you probably know this, but just in case you don't, Africa during the COVID-19 pandemic did not experience the wrath of the virus. And as you see right here, not too much bad happening for most of Africa. But what's interesting is that South Africa, a country that you recognize probably as being one of the most quote unquote developed countries, one of the most forward countries. Many of us want to go to South Africa. South Africa actually did very, very bad. It did the worst of all African countries. Now, I'm going to read to you some articles. They want to say that it's because South Africa tested more. To me, this is ludicrous. The fact is that South Africa, its situation being subjugated to white dominion is what made the virus, for some reason, I don't know exactly why, other than the spiritual wrath of Yah, on those populations that are oppressing our people. For some reason, our people that were amongst that system face worse prospects. And this is despite the fact South Africa supposedly has better health systems, is richer, has better neighborhoods, better sanitation, better all this, better all that, the things that are associated with the Western South Africa. And of course, this is not just South Africa. The same is the story with the entire world. We saw the world that is developed, the world that is forward, the world that is cosmopolitan, suffering during the COVID-19 pandemic. Now, I personally, speaking carefully about that pandemic, I think that absolutely, we know that the lab leak, obviously, we're allowed to talk about it now because it's confirmed that there was a lab leak. I also personally think that that disease was intended to have a certain effect on the world. That's what I'll say. It was intended to have a certain effect on the world that comports, I would say, with the agenda laid out inside of the Georgia Guidestones. But despite that, it seems that Africa was spared. And I don't think it was supposed to be spared. I don't think it was supposed to be an area that was not going to face the wrath of this virus. I think it was actually the opposite. But let's read through this first article. So this article is going to tell you about the differences that were reported in the deaths of people with COVID-19 around the world. Since the start of the pandemic, Africa has reported more than 12 million COVID-19 cases and 255,000 deaths. Total that seems vast, but pale in comparison to reported cases and deaths among countries in North America, Europe, and Asia. By contrast, the United States has amassed more than 85 million cases and 101 million recorded COVID-19 deaths, including as many as 5,000 deaths in a single day during the winter 2021 surge. Africa's low death count has baffled health experts and government officials, but growing data contrasts previous widespread assertions over the last 2 years that COVID-19 spared the continent. Now, this article that they're going to cite, the whole purpose of them putting this out there is they're trying to combat the idea that Africa did not face the wrath of the virus. The reason is because despite the fact that people obviously had COVID-19 because they found antibodies whenever they tested random samples of people, and that's what at least that's what's been reported, that they found antibodies in many African people. They estimated probably about 75% or something like that of our people had contracted it, but just weren't affected by it. And the reason that they're trying to combat that is because Africa also has low vaccination rates. So how do you explain this to the world whenever you're actually telling them, oh, you need to take this thing for your good? And yet Africa has low vaccination rates and also has low death rates and also did not have high hospitalizations. How is it possible that that could happen? Well, we have to find a way to discount that it did happen. Now, the report is not peer-reviewed, so that's also something that has to be emphasized. But the study said, led by the School of Public Health researchers, suggests that COVID-19 death toll in Africa is substantially higher than official records indicate. It goes on to say that the reason for these higher death counts are unclear, and that's what should be emphasized. Many surmise that Africa's younger population or greater exposure to COVID-19 or other diseases such as malaria may produce greater immunity to severe cases and deaths, with some officials stating that a high number of deaths would go unnoticed in local communities. So essentially they're saying that the reason why Africa didn't have the same deaths that the West has is because people were just in their communities and that we just didn't notice it happening. More and more experts believe that the COVID-19 burden in Africa has been underreported. That's what they're saying. Some are still hesitant that the actual death toll is drastically different from government reports. Some experts have speculated that Africa's younger population or greater exposure to the COVID-19 or other diseases might have led to asymptomatic cases or greater immunity and fewer hospitalizations or deaths. Others have gone far as to say that a death in Africa never goes unrecorded. And I don't know if that's true, but I will say that for some reason we don't see any people who are having problems with the reporting of other causes of death in Africa. They have all the numbers as far as how many people died from famine in Africa. They had all the numbers as far as how many people died from HIV/AIDS in Africa. They have all the numbers as far as how many people died from Ebola or from malaria or from poor health conditions. They have all the numbers. They even have numbers of how many people died from climate change. But for some reason, only with COVID-19, they do not have the numbers. There could be people who died that we don't know about. That's what they're putting forth to us. So I want to go forward into another article. Trying to solve a mystery, Africa's low death rates. The low rate of coronavirus infections, hospitalization, and deaths in West and Central Africa is the focus of a debate that has divided scientists on the continent and beyond. Have the sick or dead simply not been counted? If COVID was in fact has done less damage here, why is it? It has been it's been so vicious. How have we missed it? The assertion that COVID isn't as big a threat in Africa has sparked debate about whether the African Union's push to vaccinate 70% of Africans against the virus this year is the best use of health resources, given the fact that the devastation from other pathogens, such as malaria, appears to be much higher. Doesn't make sense. If you have things that are killing Africans, and we have the numbers to prove it. People die from malaria. We have the numbers to prove it. And yet you're putting all your money towards something that, from what we see, didn't kill Africans. How does that make sense? In the first months of the pandemic, there was fear that COVID might eviscerate Africa. And I remember this. Tearing through the country's health systems as weak as Sierra Leone's, where there are only 3 doctors for every 100,000 people, according to the World Health Organization. The high prevalence of malaria, HIV, tuberculosis, and malnutrition was seen as a kindling for disaster. That has not happened. The first iteration of the virus that raced around the world had comparatively minimum impact here. The Beta variant ravaged South Africa, as did the Delta and Omicron, yet the rest of the continent did not record similar death tolls. Into year 3 of the pandemic, new research shows there is no longer any question of whether COVID has spread widely in Africa. It has. Studies that tested blood samples for antibodies to SARS-CoV-2, the official name of the virus that causes COVID, shows that about 2/3 of the population, so that's even lower than what I said, 2/3 of the population in most sub-Saharan African countries do indeed have those antibodies. Since only 14% of the population has received any kind of COVID vaccination, the antibodies are overwhelmingly from infection. A new WHO-led analysis, not yet peer-reviewed, synthesizes surveys from across the continent and found that 65% of Africans had been infected by the third quarter of 2021, higher than the rate in many parts of the world. Just 4% of Africans had been vaccinated when this data was gathered. So the virus in Africa is in Africa. Is it killing people? And it didn't. The one sub-Saharan country though, with almost every death counted is South Africa, and it's clear from the data that COVID has killed a great many people in that country, far more than the reported virus deaths. Excess mortality data shows that between May 2020 and September 2021, some 250,000 people, more people, died from natural causes than was predicted for that time period based on a pattern in previous years. Surges in death rates match these COVID cases, suggesting the virus was the culprit. However, there's also another culprit. So we do know that even during the COVID-19 pandemic, that the death rate did increase in Africa, as it did all over the world. But is that because of COVID-19 essentially killing people? Well, actually, the reason why is because people were forced to lock down. And during those lockdowns, a lot of people who were receiving health care from different institutions were not able to go to those institutions. So reading from another article, local systems for reporting deaths in Africa make it difficult to hide COVID-19 casualties. And some of the excess deaths of the past year can be attributed not to the disease, but to lockdown measures that cut off access to medical care for other illnesses as well as other necessities. And many of you probably remember how hard it was to get into hospitals and the fact that many people had to stay home from the hospitals. Many people who were getting treatment were not able to get treatment. So that is the reason for COVID-19 having an effect as far as increased deaths. But yet they weren't able to still explain the vast difference of deaths inside of Africa to the rest of the world. Just think about it. America had the highest death rate inside of the pandemic, the highest. Over 1 million people did. Now, the reason I wanted to call this video the Goshen effect, or people in Africa did not get what they were saying they were going to get. Now, it doesn't mean that we've been immune from other attacks from our enemies, but in this instance, this thing that I think was really supposed to do damage to our people didn't do the damage that it was geared to do. And again, I remember the news reports. I remember people were saying, oh no, Africa doesn't have the things that we have. They don't have the facilities. They don't have the health care. They already have a population that's sick from other things. They have poverty. This is going to decimate Africa. I remember seeing those reports, and it actually made me scared for Africa. And yet the exact opposite happened. Meanwhile, in America, where we're sold a dream. We're sold that this is the land of the free and the home of the brave, that everyone can come here and be treated as a human being. In that country, the death rate was not only so bad, but for our people in America, our same people, same DNA. So it's not a matter of, one DNA was doing better than the other. Like, our people in America faced far worse ramifications from the virus. COVID-19 stunningly unequal death toll in America in one chart. COVID-19 has torn through Black America, with the virus taking the lives of Black people in the U.S. at twice the rate of white Americans. All of America's minorities, with the exception of Asian Americans, have seen worse outcomes than white people during the coronavirus pandemic. But Black Americans have fared worse, with about 1 in every 1,000 Black Americans dying from COVID-19 since February. This is about 40,000 people who have lost their lives. For their share of the U.S. population, Black people are dying in the pandemic at twice the rate of white Americans, of whom 1 in every 2,150 died. I want this to seriously resonate with you. America had the highest number of deaths inside of the entire world when it came to COVID-19. Of that, our people were dying at twice the rate of white people dying. So a good amount of the people who died from this were our people. A huge amount of our people died from this pandemic. And despite the fact that we were living in a developed country, one that's supposed to be superior, one that is the richest country in the world, how is it that our people were dying at such a high rate and the continent of Africa, minus South Africa, was not? And then even in the African continent, how is it that the people of South Africa were doing the worst? How is it? How is it possible? And the scientists are baffled. I believe it's very simple, though. The Almighty had mercy on us. Although this was supposed to take us out, that wasn't in our future, or that wasn't in his plans for us. So I want to use this just as an example of when we talk about Goshen. Many of us want to put ourselves inside of a realm of peace, and the idea that Goshen follows you wherever you go. I think Goshen is a lot different than I believe in Yeshua, his son, therefore I'm good. I really think it's about submitting to him and to his will. Because frankly, I believe, I'm of the opinion that if our people who are inside of the system would find ways to get away from the system, even if you don't leave the continent, even if you have to separate from the communities in a real and substantial way, I firmly believe that a similar grace would be applied to us. In fact, other countries I know outside of the United States, I believe Haiti was one of them, also had similar effect. Now, if you think, well, there's a reason for this, also compare Africa to what happened in Latin America. You could compare them in many instances as far as the effects, because they have similar demographics, similar poverty, even though Africa's is worse as far as poverty, but similar, very similar at the same time. Latin America was decimated. Brazil, another country that's very clear apartheid country, decimated. Yet our people in Africa spared. I don't have the answers. I don't know the fullness of it. I don't have that revelation for you, but I do know that there's something significant happening when the Almighty's hand will stop something that's literally designed and created to take you out. And that shows you that it's not just about your genealogy. It's not just about your belief system. It also comes down to where you are physically and what you are doing in connection to the system. I believe the dependency on the system is the biggest thing that will separate you as far as whether you are Goshen or not. Attachment to the system. When the system goes down, are you going down with it? That type of thing, I think, marks you as far as whether or not you're going to go down with the system whenever it does implode, and it will implode at some point. So that's what I have. Hopefully that wasn't too heavy of a topic, but just something I've been wanting to talk about for a while. I've been noticing the differences with the COVID-19 pandemic, and I always wanted to talk about them because I don't personally have the answers, but I haven't seen anyone wanting to digest that one or wanting to dissect it rather. And I think that it's clear that regardless of anything, we can see that the grace of Yah was on the African continent at that particular time. So with that, thank you all for watching. I'll see you all in the next video.
Reverend Jackson?
I hope that in our analysis of it, we don't conclude that we ain't winning. We're winning. There's going to be an election in South Africa a few months from now because we winning. There was a Middle East agreement signed on the White House lawn last Monday because we got the scars in our bodies. We're winning. We came here 30 years ago for the March on Washington. From Texas across to Florida up to Virginia, we couldn't use a single public toilet. We could not use a single hotel. We couldn't drink water from a single fountain. we did not have the right to vote. We didn't have a congressional black caucus. We didn't have 400 black mayors. We did not have the capacity to even think about foreign affairs, dealing in private survival. But just like when David knocked down Goliath, he couldn't go and party because Goliath wasn't no eunuch, he had some babies. And you knock down Jim Crow and you got Jim Crow Esquire. The giants keep coming. And so do not end up in a way you say, well, what can we do? Well, we, in fact, the laws that trapped South Africa of apartheid in 1948 came from here, from the 1896 laws. What Mandela is trying to do now is what we achieved in 1965. The fact is, we are winning, and our struggling has not been in vain, but there are some different options. For example, when Dr. King would make the case that we just end racism by law and get inside the plant gate with an education, we can grow. That was a period of economic growth. Now we get inside the plant, and the plant is closed. There's a very different context in which we operate. Zero economic growth among the industrial nations of the world is a factor in this. The economic downturn cannot be ignored. Lastly, we beat legislation with Jim Crow, but now Jim Crow Esquire regulation. The giants keep coming. And I would say lastly, Aristide is on his way back to Haiti because of us. Mandela got out of jail because of us. We're going to bring that matter to a resolution in Nigeria because of us. And now there will be an urban policy because we will not back down. So in the face of all of these challenges, do not assume that our struggles have been in vain and not productive.
I'll take some brief comments from Minister Farrakhan and Representative Waters and then go to your questions.
The scripture teaches, my people are destroyed for the lack of knowledge. And it is ignorance that is the worst enemy of the rise of our people to fulfill our destiny. That ignorance is fed on by corrupt leadership. Now, the scripture again says, woe to the shepherds who feed themselves and not the flock. Should not the shepherds feed the flock? Most of our leaders are handpicked by the very enemy that we're trying to get free from. It's all right for us to say we have a voting rights bill and a public accommodations bill, and all of us, including myself, have benefited from those bills. But to get a public accommodations bill and a voting rights bill and then close black hotels because we sleep in white ones, or close black establishments so that we can spend our money with our oppressor, is not winning. Reverend Jackson, I submit. Wait. On one hand, we are winning because every one of these brilliant congresspersons, they represent us. They are brilliant men and women. These are brilliant people in front of us. But what good does it do to have a brilliant head not connected to a black body? I submit. That until and unless we as a mass connect with the Congressional Black Caucus and our black leaders connect to the black masses, and don't take your eye off the prize, because now you can sit in boardrooms and be media folk now, because little black people marched in the streets and suffered and went to jail. to make openings for those of us who sit in leadership. Now we've got to unite at the top and develop strategies to free our people. Otherwise, we will be saying we're winning, but the masses keep losing. So if the masses keep losing, then we can't be winning unless our agenda is personal. We're looking for self-aggrandizement. But if we're looking for the liberation, if we want the liberation of our people, then ain't none of us winning until all of us become winners.
Are you finished?
Yeah.